Hello, you're watching another podcast on becoming a board president, or in our board president series. Today we will be talking about how to run a meeting. My name is Nikki Whaley and I'm a board support specialist with Arizona School Boards Association and a school board member in the Washington Elementary School District.
And I'm Julie Bacon, Leadership Development Specialist with the Association and a board member in the Paradise Valley Unified School District.
I'm Chris Thomas, General Counsel and Associate Executive Director here at ASBA and also a former school board member in the Madison Elementary School District. We're going to talk about a lot of policies today because we're talking about running a board meeting. There are a number of policies in your B section policies that deal with this very subject. I want to just note and commend to you that your policy manual is several hundred pages long, but the policy that you need to be most concerned about is that section B policies. And we're going to talk about a number of those, and you can see which ones there are up there, and we'll go into detail about a few of them. The first thing you want to say, be aware of is the fact that there's different types of meetings. We have different meetings that we call meetings with the school boards. First of all, you have your regular meeting. Typically, it's at least once a month during the school year. Oftentimes, it's twice a month. You establish the schedule for the regular meetings by July 1, and that's noted on your website. You may also have special meetings, and they sometimes are called works or study sessions, retreats, but they're meetings that are besides your regular meetings, and usually they deal with some very pointed topics that you want to discuss, and then maybe bring forth for recommendations at your regular meeting at a future time. There's also another kind of meeting that we did not mention up there because it really deserves further discussion, which is your executive sessions, which are typically a meeting within a meeting at your regular meetings, or sometimes in your special meetings as well, but those are under the open meeting law meetings in which the public has been excluded for one reason or another. But just a couple of policies that we want to make clear that you understand is one is BEDB, and that is the outline of your board agenda. It's essentially a template of the order of the business you're going to take on at your board meetings. Now that's one that's not dictated by law. We do have a model policy that we think works best, but of course your district can modify that and decide which works best for you. But that BEDB policy is your template of the order of agenda items in your typical board agenda. BEDBA is a very critical policy, and it's one of critical importance to everyone, but particularly the board president, because that is how your agenda gets created. It is essentially, we'll go into detail about how that works, but that's the process by which items get on the agenda. And we'll go into detail on that.
So with agenda setting, the role of the board president is to represent the rest of the board in meeting with the superintendent to create the board agenda. It's really important here for the board president to realize that they're not the gatekeeper. A lot of times people think that board president and the superintendent create the meeting, and then therefore it's the board president that decides with the superintendent what's going to be covered and what's not. The board president is really there as a representation of the board so that you don't have 6 people creating this process, to sit with the superintendent and say, these are the things that the other board members would like to cover. These are the things that we need to cover. The superintendent will bring that information. And then how do we fit that in together? So you do have a policy that dictates that, and that the superintendent will prepare board meeting agendas in consultation with the board president, that the superintendent will approve of the board president on behalf of the governing board to place any items on the agenda. So that means that the superintendent also is not the gatekeeper, and that they are going to be working with you to ensure that both sides get things covered. And that any board member opposing an item for consideration for placement on the agenda will notify the superintendent within 5 days. So if there's something going on the agenda that you don't think should be on the agenda, you have an opportunity to have a conversation to postpone that, and their board president can do that as well. But ultimately, it is on the board agenda, the work of the administration and the business that needs to be done. So this agenda is really your guide to making sure that you fulfill your obligations as a board. Sometimes that is through reports and information provided by the superintendent and the administration. And sometimes that's brought forth from board trying to meet the needs of the community. I don't know if Julie, you want to talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I think this gets into kind of a sticky situation with some boards who board members want to get items on the agenda that perhaps the board president and the superintendent don't think are necessary. And then you get into kind of a power play. So I think it's really important when Nikki and I go out and do communication protocols with boards, figure out how your board is going to handle future agenda item requests. Some people put it on the agenda that, you know, every meeting board members can recommend something for a future agenda item. Some just have a policy by which a board member notifies the superintendent and board president that they'd like to see this on the agenda item. Because really the president is not the gatekeeper of the board's agenda. So we want to make sure as you're doing this that the items that board members want to talk about get on an agenda. And sometimes maybe it's not a regular meeting agenda is the best place for it. Maybe the best place for it is in a study or work session where you can have a little bit more in-depth conversation. It's a little bit less formal. So you have to work with your board members and your superintendent to figure out the best place for an item and the best way to get something on an agenda.
There are reasons why something might not get on an agenda that's been requested. One is it may take some staff time to work on that, to bring forth information relevant to the item. The other one could be that it's been discussed before recently and there's not support for that item, not only appearing on a future agenda, but not support for the item generally. So you need to move on to other business. And those are all good reasons to do it. Again, what we don't want to have is that where a board member has an issue, they would love to have some discussion by the board about that issue. And it's just a question of, the board president doesn't agree, so it doesn't get on the agenda. So we want to avoid those kind of situations, at least allow for one discussion of the item and then move on to other business.
And we also talk about, I know Nikki and I talk about having like a process. So if there is some item is recommended for the agenda that both the board president and the superintendent don't think is appropriate for maybe just for reasons that Chris just talked about, how do you get the whole board to weigh in on that? Have a process for that, because that might be the way that you have to have the board vote on whether it's something they want to see on a future agenda. That's just one option, but figuring that out for yourself and your board is really important.
Right, so as the board president, some strategies to have regarding setting your agenda is to first perhaps have a study session, if you haven't done so already, to talk about the protocols around that. So if you as a board president are trying to figure out a way to ensure that no board member feels that they're being blocked out of the process, talking about the protocols of, okay, this is how we're going to get the agenda items on, setting an expectation of when those agenda items might be covered. I'll give you an example. I've worked with some smaller boards that when they ask for a future agenda item, the expectation is at the very next meeting that agenda item will be placed. But I know, for example, in my district where we have quite a few agenda items, sometimes it might not be for a couple different couple meetings, or maybe there's a particular time of year that makes more sense. The important part for the board president to remember is to communicate that, to not keep that process private. One way we do that in Washington is we have an Excel spreadsheet that we track all board requests, when it was made, who made it, and then the anticipated data that would be covered. And that's shared with the rest of the board so that board members know that their requests haven't been ignored. It's also really important for board president, as you're making those decisions on what should be on the agenda and what shouldn't, and you're getting those requests from board members, to have a guiding document. And a lot of times that's your own strategic plan or maybe your own board goals from your board self-evaluation. Once you know what your priorities are, it's a lot easier to help your board members guide their requests in alignment with what you're already working on, instead of following after requests that really don't serve a greater purpose.
And that's why we've talked in a number of these podcasts about having good relationships with your board members as a board president. And this is one reason this is one area in which that would be very helpful. Next, we're going to talk about rules of order. And these are your district's flow of the meeting. This is how you run your meetings. Most of us have pretty simple rules of order. We don't necessarily recommend Robert's rules of order. They were intended for maybe larger boards, and they don't really necessarily fit into the way boards run their meetings. Is there anything else you want to say about that, Chris?
No, just that Roberts tends to be for large legislative bodies, and kind of they can be very technical in many ways, and we don't want the process, the procedure to sort of take over the substance of what we're there to talk about. So, we typically say, somebody makes a motion, there's a second to the motion. If somebody wants to amend the motion, generally speaking, we prefer that there's a withdrawal of the motion and a new motion stated. It's just a lot cleaner that way. And there's also different kinds of ways of dealing with it. Substitute motions and things that are frowned upon. We'd rather just take one item at a time. We don't want people to be confused about what motion they're on, or where the process is going, as opposed to why they're there, the substance of what they're there to talk about.
Right, and you can find your rules of order in your policies BEDD. And I think we all need to make sure that the policy BEDD is actually what we're doing in our meetings, because I think sometimes there's a disconnect between what you have in policy and what you're doing in practice. So if you don't love what you're doing in practice, go look at what you have in policy. And if it's the same, then you can change, the board as a whole can change that, but you just need to make sure that you keep it in policy, but also it's there for the transparency for the community. So they understand how your meeting is going to go.
And I just want to put out there, so the board approves policy, and then of course the administration creates the regulations. But if this is one area of policy, would be policies where the board can make their own regulations in terms of how they're going to put into practice this, because this is how they're going to govern themselves. And oftentimes what I've seen anyway is that they have a policy that's pretty vague, but doesn't necessarily go through how they're going to deal with situations. So one thing as a board president you may want to think about are what are some common scenarios in terms of rules of order of the meeting that you may want to create with your team a practice around. For example, what do you do with friendly amendments? What do you do with wanting to table something? Writing those out and sitting down and maybe even having a committee or working with an administration to write some of those basics down in your regulation might be something to turn to when things start to get tough. Because what we've realized is that usually board meetings run just smoothly until there's contention. And then it's very hard to come to consensus around some things. So if you come to consensus around your rules of order and how you're going to deal with certain situations ahead of time, you'll be in a better place to run your meeting.
So one thing that as a board president, one is you're going to need to know your rules of order really well, because you're going to be the one who has to rule on motions and whether or not they're in order. So whatever procedure you have, make sure you understand it. Second is to also understand, as a board president, you are a full member of the board. You can make motions, you can second vote motions, and you can vote on motions. So I know in some boards, maybe if you were at a corporate board or a nonprofit board or something like that, the board president doesn't make motions and doesn't vote on motions. That's not the case here. You are, like we said, a leader among leaders. You're not only the board president, but you're also a full member.
And really, aren't we statutorily required to let the public know what our vote is, no matter who we are on the board?
Absolutely.
So that's something to keep in the back of your mind as well.
So then we move to consent agenda. The consent agenda is a list of items that are on your regular agenda that are routine, and they're usually put under one heading. It allows for a unified motion and action. So some things that you might see in a consent agenda are personnel changes, monthly bills, approval of the previous minutes, field trips or acceptance of gifts. These are things that reoccur at each meeting that don't have a lot of conversation about. It gives a little bit more leeway for you to manage your meeting in time and pace, because it allows you to approve all of those in one swoop instead of individually. However, you can always pull something from a consent agenda. So if you do use consent agenda, it would be important as board president to explain the process for removing things from consent agenda when and if a board member feels that they either have further questions or need to recuse themselves, so that you have that practice in place as well.
I think the use of the consent agenda is a brilliant way to better manage your meeting and allow the time for the items that need discussion and voting for approval, so that the board has the time to have robust conversations in public about the items that they're voting on.
It also is one, the board has some statutory responsibilities to do, but they're not areas that we expect them to actually be involved in. They're operational elements of the school district, such as approval of vouchers and approval of, some of those things of personnel changes. While ultimately you have the statutory responsibility to approve those things, it's not expected that you're going to be really get your hands dirty in those areas. Yes, you're a watchdog, and you want to be aware of what you're voting on, but at the same time, it's not something that you're really expected to be intimately involved in.
I think the other thing for people to know, just because you have a consent agenda, you still get all the backup materials for those items. So you'll be able to look at the personnel changes before you get to the meeting. You'll be able to look at your vouchers and your monthly bills and payments. So it's not as if it's on the consent agenda, you get no information on it. That's not the case. You have the opportunity to review all of the documentation, so you can be that watchdog, that community person who's really keeping an eye on what the district is doing.
But the key thing is to not get involved in the
day-to-day
micromanaging of exactly that process.
Right. So public participation at board meetings, that is something that we always is an important part of being the board president, which is that you have to manage that public participation at your meetings, and it's done pursuant to your board policy. I always tell everybody under the open meeting law that there's not a requirement that the public participate in your meetings. They're there to, they have the responsibility or the authority to see you make decisions on their behalf and to engage to the extent that you have defined it. We like to say that board meetings are in the public, but not for the public. They're not supposed to be town hall type situations. But most boards do have public participation policy. You want to make sure that the rules are clear. You want to make sure that they are enforced every time. So things like time limits for speakers, or whether or not somebody needs to sign in to be able to speak, and whether or not how you take public comment, whether it's all in one lump part of the agenda under called the public, or whether or not you take comment on individual agenda items. Whatever that is, you need to understand how that works and be consistent about how you follow it. You also need to be consistent in working with your fellow board members to do it, because if something is not on the agenda, the public may have a right to speak, assuming you have an open call to the public, but other board members should not be engaging in the substance of those debate. They need to understand what the rules are. So you may have the responsibility of gaveling board members out of order if they want to respond, and also to set the rules for an open call so that everybody understands that board members cannot comment on something that's not appearing on the agenda.
I think this for me is one of the hardest things to do as board president, because when you have people coming to talk to you, they're passionate about what they're coming to talk to you about, and we have a 3-minute limitation, so you can do public comment for 3 minutes if you're representing an individual or yourself. And to cut people off in the middle of a statement when it's after 3 minutes is particularly difficult. But for consistency's sake, and to make sure that there is equal opportunity for all community members, you have to do it. And it's a hard thing to do.
Yeah, so some strategies there, as mentioned, was to be consistent. You should probably put that in writing somewhere. So in your policy, you might want to say that we will allow this amount of time. But remember that you have flexibility. As board president, if, for example, you have 35 people showing up all to talk about the same thing, you can have some leeway in saying, okay, we're going to allow everybody just 1 minute instead of 3 minutes so that everyone can speak. Or you may decide to have them select out 3 representatives to speak on a topic. This is something that you can do, but you want to be consistent in the way that you do that. And so having some contingencies of when you're going to have so many, if we have a topic that becomes very large and we expect a lot of public participation, you may want to give yourself more time in your regular agenda to allow for that, so that you're not then there till 10 o'clock to deal with the business that you already had to do. Or you may find that you have to do comments and take comments in writing. So come up with strategies, but just make sure that as a team you agree and that you're consistent with them.
And if you're going to change them, you need to let your community know well in advance.
This is one area where the board president does have to have a heavier hand, and that is you need to maintain order, you need to maintain decorum. If folks are not following your rules or procedures, or they're being disrespectful, they're using profanity or something like that, where they're not honoring the fact that this is official government businesses going on, you need to make sure that you bring things back to point. You need to gavel people out of order, and if it really gets bad, you need to declare a recess of the meeting and let tempers cool, because this is one area where the board president really does have to conduct the meeting and make sure that it stays on point and is getting taking care of the public business at hand.
Talk to other board presidents too. We are certainly here to help. ASBA is here to help and provide some guidance or recommendations. But ultimately, it's your community, and if you need to find others that maybe have a similar community, or maybe others that you know have gone through that, you can always work with other board presidents or previous board presidents of your own board to come up with strategies.
That's right. Not an easy job, but an important one. So thank you so much for joining us for this section about running a meeting, and we hope you listen to all the other sections in this board president series.